Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members, for inviting us, and thank you for your efforts on this committee. I know you've got a very broad agenda, and you're discussing some outrageously huge topics, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing with respect to listening to people from giving you testimony on today and this week's topic, to your earlier efforts, all the way forward to when you report back to the legislature, but also, just personally, thank you so much for all you've done to help us through this crisis. I know that you've all stood up and helped your constituents day by day maneuver one of the biggest challenges we've ever faced in the province, and I really wanted to pass on my thank you for that. Personally, I don't think we can say thanks enough. My gosh, it's been quite a few months, hasn't it? Thank you. I could talk all day on this stuff, but I know that the chair will let me know when I have 5 minutes to go, right? Mr. Stewart, thank you. Today I'm going to take you through a very high-level conversation to help set your stage, I think, for the conversations in the days to come. I'll focus in on Crown Forest. Let me just say why. We can talk about herbicide and pesticides use in agriculture any day, but it is entirely a different topic. And I would recommend that you pursue that conversation on another day. But I've chosen to focus primarily on herbicide use in our Crown Forest because it's the largest source. I want to take you through some slides, which I'll go through really quickly, I think, on the extent of use of herbicides in New Brunswick forest. I want to point you to some new articles that are popping up all over the place in peer-reviewed scientific journals. I want to talk to you about what's pushing the bans in other parts of the world, the key factors. I want to tell you a little bit of a story about how Quebec managed to ban the use of herbicides on its Crown forests quite a few years ago now, and I'll leave you with some recommendations. Okay, I have to do this. Do you want to do this for me? It's just our acknowledgement. This is our acknowledgement statement. This is from the Chief Medical. Look how I have to use one. So this is from the Chief Medical Officer's Health Report in 2016, almost 5 years ago now. Came out in September of that year. And the reason I put this data up in front of you is to show that even though we're relatively small forests with a large percentage of Crown forests in our makeup, we use a substantial amount of herbicides. Now this data is all forests, not just Crown forests, so be clear about that. That's what the Chief Medical Officer of Health did. She combined everything. And I've thrown some other provinces up there for comparison using the all forest data. And I've also, this wasn't in the Medical Officer of Health report in 2016, I've thrown in Maine for comparison. Okay, to just give you that sort of sense of, well, here on the left-hand side are two very large provinces with very extensive forest practices and forest management in their Crown forests, using less per capita in their Crown forest than New Brunswick. And of course, the little 3D thing of Quebec there shows you zero forest in Quebec, forest sprayed in Quebec. So who actually carries out this spraying? This is a big, wide graph. All of this data comes from NRCan through their National Forestry Management statistics. They've been keeping, that department's been keeping those statistics since 1990, and all of the provinces feed up that data to the national inventory. So this is New Brunswick data, and it shows you the area of the Crown, and this one is just specific to Crown forest. Remember the one before was a combo forest, private plus Crown. This is specific to Crown forest, and it shows you the companies that are spraying hectares in the Crown forest over time. Okay, so they just got all different color coded. And the very next slide is is exactly the same data, just a little bit easier to bite or chew off. It's a shorter time frame from 2013 to 2020. Remember back at the beginning, I said there's a lot of new science. There's nothing like the IARC report, the report on glyphosate as possible as a carcinogen. It sparked a whole new bunch of scientific studies into the fate of glyphosate in nature, and some new science coming out on the impacts on human health. And I have to tell you, members, there's very seldom a day goes by that I don't see a new peer-reviewed scientific article about new research that's found impact. So all I've done is picked some headlines from the science journals to give you a sense of this developing field, but also where herbicides are showing up where we have been told for the last 30 years they wouldn't show up. So you can see there's been studies out of McGill University looking at how derivatives of this herbicide can leach phosphorus out of agriculture and forest soils. You can see where some scientists out in BC are seeing residues of glyphosate in berries, and the one that I read last week was on the prickly rose. If you've been out in New Brunswick in our Crown Forest, you've seen our version of the prickly rose. So I guess what I'm saying is that these new bodies of science coming in with impact on water, impact on plants, impact on mammals, and impact on vertebrates, including human vertebrates. There's a wealth of it. It's very hard to keep atop of, and nor would I expect you as lay people and great leaders from your communities that you would. But I did want to show, I didn't want to bring in a big stack of science for you to have to read. Scientists, as you know, are pretty smart people, and you can find most of these articles in French and in English languages. And in the abstracts, they definitely explain the scope of their investigations. I want to touch now, and this is an ever-changing database. Where is it banned? It's banned in a lot of places, a lot of jurisdictions all over the world. The big bans that people follow, of course, are the countrywide bans: France, Austria, Mexico, Argentina. The big region-wide bans, the debate within the European community itself. But there's also been cities, municipalities, and regions in all of these countries that have almost always gone out before their federal governments or even their state or provincial governments and brought in restrictions primarily on the cosmetic use of herbicides. So that would be on municipal golf courses, municipal grounds, and people's lawns, trying to get at that unnecessary use of herbicides that very much a part of the conversation. The 2 or 3 most recent ones that I thought were important was Germany's commitment to phase it out by 2024, France's commitment to phase it out by the end of this year, and then also from a commercial or market use, when Kellogg's committed to not buy products sprayed with glyphosate by 2024. So that's your Cheerios, your cornflakes, they use a lot of grain, and they've been pushed obviously by their consumers to ask their farmers to grow things differently. If you only, I'll go to the next slide, if you only read one paper, this is the one that I would recommend. And through you, Mr. Chair, I would, any of these papers that I cited are available, and I can email them either to the clerk or to individual members. I should have said that at the beginning, sorry, Chairperson. But if there's only one paper that you read, it should be this one, 2016, a consensus statement by health scientists in response to the IARC report, and these are their 7 consensus statements. Glyphosate-based herbicides are the most heavily applied in the world, and its usage continues to rise. Worldwide, they are often found contaminating drinking water sources, rain, snow, and air, especially in agricultural regions. The half-life of glyphosate in water and soil is much longer than the earlier science on the chemical told us. It's widely present in the global soybean supply. Human exposure to glyphosate-based herbicides is rising. It's now authoritatively classified as a possible human carcinogen, and we can talk about that in the question period. And regulatory estimates of tolerable daily intakes in the United States, the European Union, are based on outdated science. And you can put, because Health Canada so closely follows the US EPA in its regulatory approach. The scientists didn't say that, that's why I didn't put in Canada. But I think you definitely can leap to that. What's driving these science and these bans? First, the IARC report out of 2015. Like I mentioned, this new scientific evidence. Public concern, you cannot discount the fact that over 35,000 New Brunswickers have written into, some of you, and signed petitions, and a lot of you have stood up in the House and presented these petitions, thank you very much, saying that they are concerned about it and asking for their government to move to phase it out in the Crown Forest. And of course, the multi-million-dollar lawsuits are really pushing it hard. So and just a couple of weeks ago, Bayer settled for $12 billion to settle these older lawsuits that they had lost in court in the US on. And they've also just recently settled a new case in Sacramento for $25 million. So concern over litigation based on health impacts is really driving. I'm going to switch over now to back up what I've said about the people of New Brunswick are concerned. As recently as August and early September of last year, we conducted some public polling province-wide, a sample size of 500. So as you know, that's a very good double-sized public opinion poll, along with the Atlantic Salmon Federation, Canadian Parks and Wilderness New Brunswick chapter, and the Conservation Council, to ask them a whole number of questions about what they thought about the state of the forest. And I have all that data. I have that data with me if you want to drill down a little bit in the question period about it. But I wanted to draw your attention to this. 76%, over 3/4 of New Brunswickers don't want to see herbicides such as glyphosate used in their forest. 87%, and this is kudos to the department, want the government to keep its promise on more protected land. And New Brunswickers' top concern about what's happening in the Crown Forest: clear cutting and logging. Let me tell you a bit about what happened in Quebec. Over 20, almost 30 years ago now, there was quite a controversy, not just in Quebec, all over Canada and the world, about the use of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T as the common pesticides of the day. At the time, the government instructed a panel, BAPE, you've probably heard about them, to go out and hold public hearings to get citizens, scientists, other policy experts' opinion about the use of herbicides in the Crown Forest, and they reported back with a general recommendation that herbicides of all types, including glyphosate, should be phased out of use in the Quebec forest by 2011. They went back to the people 5 years later to hear more, and again, they stuck to that recommendation. And the government stuck to that recommendation, changed the Crown Forest Act, and it's been banned for use in the Crown Forest since that date. And I thought it might be interesting for you to see a review that was conducted by the Canadian Forest Service, and I understand you have a couple of experts from CFS in over the next few days. But this review was conducted by them to sort of see how was it working? How did they survive? You can imagine the doom and gloom that Quebec leaders heard from industry about we'll all go bankrupt. But what they found was that that foresters needed to pay more attention to vegetation management, that Quebec was adequately releasing its seedlings mechanically and with crews on most sides. On most sites, it was based on early reforestation, the use of taller planting stock, and intensive mechanical release. They were able to, these companies that operate in the Quebec Crown Forest, was able to bring crop trees to the free to grow stage without the crutch, without the use of herbicides, and without resulting in major effects of the crop that they were growing. And the scientists from CFS said that this vegetation management strategy, and this is, I think, the important part from my perspective, is an important asset in the implementation of an ecosystem-based management. If you want to get back to nature, something that respects nature, then this will work. So I'll flip you right last. How am I doing? We're good, thank you. Our Crown Forests and Lands Act hasn't been updated for 30 years. You need to update it. I know that's not the job of this committee. The minister has heard this 87 times, maybe 89 times from me. So apologize for the repetition, Minister. If you want to get at the use of herbicides in our Crown Forest, you have to recommend that the government reduce the size of clear cuts. Herbicides are kind of a symptom of a problem, like a crutch when you have a sprained ankle or a broken leg. It's a symptom of a broader problem, which is large-scale clear cutting. If you can bring down the size of clear cutting in the Crown Forest, and if you can bring down clear cuts, abut to clear cuts of 5 years ago more often, then you can dramatically reduce herbicide use in the Crown Forest. You've got to make a recommendation to the legislature that you stop using taxpayers' money to pay for this. It will help the industry adjust when you stop cutting checks for poisons in the Crown Forest. You need to, I think, make a recommendation that you have a policy, that you support a policy intention to phase it out. I would prefer that you move really quickly on that. I know the ledge isn't sitting, but you can make a unanimous statement as soon as possible that we need to figure out how to phase it out. Some other activists will want it stopped tomorrow, but if we look to the Quebec picture and look to changes in Crown Forest, we know that this doesn't happen at lightning speed, and you do need to give the industry some time to adapt and to build up their workforces and their crews. But you do need to ban it. You're going to hear from industry, I can't do anything different than the way we've been doing things for 20 years. Can't do it differently. I just don't buy it. I think there's an awful lot of smart foresters in this province. I think there's an awful lot of talent within the industry. And when they put their mind to it, they can do it. They'll still be able to employ people to run their pulp mills, to work in the woods. But if we don't have legislators standing up with citizens and scientists saying you've got to move this, the industry will not change. Think about reform of Crown Forestry as a fairness umbrella. And underneath this fairness umbrella is government-to-government negotiation with First Nations, sorely overdue. Under this fairness umbrella, is taking timber supply and wood supply from private woodlot owners before you dip into nature on Crown lands. Under this fairness umbrella comes all the small furry animals, all the birds, the butterflies, the insects that live and survive in our forests. So you've got, I don't really like this phrase, but you've got a perfect storm. You've got the crisis of climate change coming up at you. You've got the crisis in nature coming up at you. You've got this fairness, access to fairness demand in front of you. And you've got overwhelming public support to figure out how to wrestle this to the ground and just say that, thank you very much, see you later, on glyphosate use in the Crown Forest. As I told you, I could talk all day, but I won't. And the chair was so nice and polite. I think I'll leave it there. And I'll take any questions through you, Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Kuhn, go ahead. You've got 10 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to our presenters. Thank you, Ms. Corbett, for your presentation. So, as you pointed out, there's a ever-growing body of evidence of the risks associated with the use of glyphosate ecologically, to wildlife, to human health, and the damage it can do. I feel like we've seen this story before. It's kind of like that movie Groundhog Day, you know, where herbicides and other pesticides, like insecticides, but you mentioned 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, and they get used and they get used and they get used, and the evidence starts to mount in the literature that there are problems with it, even though they went through the regulatory process and were deemed safe if you follow the label, until they're not anymore. And then the body of evidence finally reaches the point where government, the regulator, takes action and deregisters them or bans them. And we've seen that over and over and over with different pesticide products. That happened with 2,4-D, 2,4,5-T, which were widely used on the forest. That happened with phenetrathion, which was being used for budworm, and of course an insecticide in that case. And the list is long. And here we are again with glyphosate, which has been used for quite a long time now, and the evidence and the science has started to reach a point where you've got to say, why is this still permitted in Canada for these uses on forests, for example, by Health Canada? So can you speak to the regulatory process? Because what happens regularly is simply we hear, well, it's gone through the regulatory process, and so it's good. It's got the stamp of approval from the Government of Canada, and there are no problems with it as a result.
Right. So, thank you for the question. Lots of folks may not have had an opportunity, but if you do get to a beach or your favorite lake and you're not fishing and you'd like to read, I would highly recommend that you read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Not just because she was the first scientist that really came out and said, whoa, this, regulated use of chemicals is really bad, but there is a New Brunswick chapter. There is a New Brunswick chapter called Rivers to the Sea, which is about the province's experiment using DDT and its impact on salmon. And so it's very relevant to you peeps. Even if it was published in 1961, it's still relevant. The story about DDT, of course, and I think it's still okay to cite it, because we're finding it in New Brunswick's lakes in places that we were not supposed to find it at all, is that the New Brunswick government banned it before the federal government. In fact, when you look at the history of herbicides and pesticides being taken off the shelf, you'll almost invariably find in Canada that a province will move first, and then Health Canada, because it's facing pressures and different laws in, from the big you know, different provinces will come in and remove it for sale. The same is true to DDT. New Brunswick stopped using it before it was banned. So you do have the power to move this step. Obviously, Quebec did, so you know that, and municipalities do. That court case was taken all the way to the Supreme Court. The companies are selling us a product, and it is in their interest, I would say, to make sure that regulatory authorities have their science and not independently funded science out there in the field. For years, were told that DDT would not, and 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T and glyphosate would not show up in water, and now science is showing that it's popping up in water. We were shown that it would not concentrate in harmful levels in soils and kill insects that we need to keep the soil healthy to grow other crops, including trees. And now we're finding it popping up. So this is how lag in science, lack of independent research, and a captured, I hate to use that term, but it is, regulatory agencies at a big, wide national level have repeated the cycle time and time again, Mr. Kuhn, and until we really wrestle with it and say, we don't need this so-called tool, we'll be stuck in that them, us debate. So we need to rise above Bayer chemicals science and other science papers and just say, we don't need it, let's move forward.
So, thank you. With respect to the regulatory process, though, when a product is first registered, obviously there's little field experience with it because it hasn't been approved. The history of this is that once it's been used for many years in the real world, and independent studies start to be done, then you start to see evidence of problems. One of the most recent is around the impacts on subsequent generations of wildlife or humans, if it's a direct exposure of humans, but of wildlife as well, where a recent paper was published, which this is called epigenetic, looking at the epigenetics of the situation, which means that the original organism exposed to the spray doesn't get sick, but subsequent generations of their progeny do develop disease related to their exposure. And it has to do with how the genes are expressed in subsequent generations, and the expression of those genes is affected by the original exposure of the original organism exposed. Anyways, point is, this is kind of the latest sorts of impacts of pesticides, including this particular paper on glyphosate, which was published in 2019. So in the review process, I mean, every so often it seems, a registered product like glyphosate gets reviewed by the federal regulatory agency, and then it gets its stamp of approval again. But the science never seems to win the day until it's overwhelmingly irrefutable. So why is that?
Well, I think that's why other scientists and conservationists like the Conservation Council would always urge legislature to use the precautionary principle. If all the data is not in front of you, then at least err on the side of precaution as opposed to willy-nilly use and broad spread use. Because I don't think there's a magic solution to that, David, Mr. Kuhn, sorry. But the rash of the new evidence showing how it's accumulated in water and fruits and berries and in stems, in forests, and in soil is outrageously alarming to me. And certainly the IARC report gave quite a boost to toxicologists and epidemiologists, and a lot of new work is coming out there. If you precaution and the precautionary principle is only written into one piece of our legislation, as far as I know, in the province, which is the Endangered Species Act, the Species at Risk Act. So err on the side of precaution. But what you have been practicing for the last 16 months is precaution. You're washing your hands, you're wearing masks. We've adapted all of society to this principle of trying to reduce your risk threshold and interfere and adopt new habits. And it's not quite an apple-to-apple comparison, but you have been cautious. Your Chief Medical Officer of Health, your Premier gave us a video on how to wash our hands. Now that was, for me, early on in COVID, the epitome of precaution. And in this case, that is the scientific principle that I think you want to line your recommendations up alongside. Let's err on the side of caution, and let's be bold in our leadership.
There was something called the Monsanto Papers, called the Monsanto Papers. It has to do with the original science carried out by Monsanto when it was the company that first developed glyphosate and registered it. Can you speak to what happened there, what those were about?
10 minutes has run out. I hadn't realized it now, so we're going to have to move on to the next questioner.